Now, the thesis that I have advanced is that all intentionality, all interpretation functions against a background of things that are presupposed, of things that are inexplicit. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the case of perception, where you interpret lines and angles as chairs and tables, even though the actual stimulus that you receive is degenerate, as they say in the trade. It underdetermines the interpretation. But you have a familiarity, you have a set of background abilities of coping with objects which enable you to interpret the random and degenerate data of your senses as meaningful objects. You convert a disordered set of sensory inputs into a meaningful output, and I've argued that you can only explain that if you take seriously the idea that you bring to bear not what the empiricists thought as a kind of tabula rasa, blank slate, when you have a perception, but you bring to bear a whole lot of experiences. Now, this is nowhere more obvious than in the interpretation of visual representations, particularly the visual arts. And as I've told you, I'm something of an eye person, what the Germans call an Augenmensch. And when I taught in Berlin, my office, I taught at the Free University, my office was like a 5 minutes walk from one of the world's great museums, the Dahlem Museum, and I used to go over and look at Terborch and Vermeer and so on. And I'm going to show you a couple of pictures that I stared at for a long time because my interpretation of these pictures was altered. Okay, here's a picture by Vermeer, and it's a typical Dutch scene. In Vermeer, it's particularly typical because the light's streaming in from the left, and they're showing off how much money they have. The oriental rug on the table is definitely a sign of wealth. They didn't walk on these rugs, they put them on tables, and the guy is pouring wine for this young lady. Now, it's interesting to see what people say about these things, so I looked this one up in standard textbooks. Now, admittedly, these guys are not the world's smartest critics, but about this one, and this is a book, who wrote it? Arthur K. Wheelock, Jr. Arthur K. Wheelock is talking about this picture, and he's comparing it with Peter de Hoogh, and I won't describe Peter de Hoogh to you, but he also does a lot of middle-class interiors. And this guy says, one major difference exists between the glass of wine, which is what you're looking at, and Peter de Hoogh's prototypes. Vermeer's interior is more elegant. It is. The figures are well dressed, the table is covered with an elaborate rug, the window contains a coat of arms, and the picture on the back wall has a gilded frame. The demeanor of the man and the woman is also so proper that no explicit association of love, such as one might make given the presence of the lute and the glass of wine, can be made. No, he says, just to read you that passage again, no explicit associations of love can be made. Well, I looked a long time at that picture, and I think it's pretty clear what's going on. That guy's trying to get that girl drunk. One way or another, we've all been in that picture. And I just think this guy did not understand the picture. Okay, it gets worse. Now here's another one of my favorite pictures. This is a fantastic picture by Terborch. All right. You'll notice I have the latest technology for all of this stuff. Well, I better have brought the Terborch, or there's no lecture today, because that's the one I really want to show you. I feel like saying everybody better empty their pockets, because I can't find my slide of the Terborch, but it's here somewhere. That's not it. That's not it. This is a reproduction. Oh, here it is. Found it. Okay. Okay. Now this is also a famous picture, and in fact Terborch did more than one of these. I've seen slightly different versions of this in different museums. This is a famous picture, and it is called The Admonition. And the father, seated on the right, is admonishing his daughter in a very gentle but nonetheless firm fashion. The mother is somewhat shyly looking down while sipping her glass of wine. That is the standard interpretation of this picture. And we know that it has to be taken seriously, that interpretation, because no less a person than Goethe gives exactly that description of the picture. I looked it up in the elective affinities. Now, it is hard for any American to imagine the intellectual importance of Goethe in German life. It's less today than it was 50 years ago. But when I was a kid, if you went to Germany, people could end a discussion by saying, "Schon Goethe hat es gesagt." Goethe said it, so it must be okay. He said that already. Now here's what Goethe says about this picture, and he's describing a party. After a party, they did what were called tableaux vivants. They did performances where everybody dressed up like the characters in the picture and showed off their fancy clothes. Now here's Goethe's description of the picture. Now they didn't have these kinds of reproductions, but they had copper engravings, and he is describing a copper engraving. He says, as the third, they had selected the so-called instruction paternelle, fatherly instruction, of Gerald Terborch, and who does not know Villa's wonderful copperplate of this painting? Who indeed? Villa's wonderful copperplate. A noble knightly father sits with one leg over the other and seems to be admonishing the daughter standing before him. His daughter, a magnificent figure in a white satin dress which hangs in abundant folds, is seen only from behind, but her whole attitude seems to indicate that she is restraining herself. The admonition is not violent or shaming. That the admonition is not violent or shaming can be seen from the father's expression and bearing. And as for the mother, she seems to be concealing a slight embarrassment by looking down into a glass of wine which she is in the act of drinking. Okay, that is Goethe's interpretation of this particular painting. The mother's looking down at the glass of wine. The daughter is slightly embarrassed but not humiliated. And the father is gently admonishing the daughter. Now, I think that is a total misconception of the picture. And later critics have gone beyond Goethe. They support my interpretation. The guy is much too young to be the father of a girl of that age. He has something totally different in mind. What he's holding in his hand is a coin, which he is about to offer for the favors of this young lady who's dressed up in the white dress. And the woman on the right is the madam of the establishment with whom he's negotiating the price. If there's any doubt about that, what the hell is that big bed doing in the background? How are we supposed to interpret that otherwise? So I think Goethe has misunderstood this picture entirely. And in fact, later interpreters will support something like my interpretation. Now, those are cases where I think the background is, if you like, we have a much more vulgar background than either of the interpreters that I have cited, and we naturally look for things that they were not inclined to look for. Okay, now I want to show you, those are cases where it's sort of easy, but here's a case where it seems to me it's really pretty hard. This is in Venice. I've taught everywhere, and when I was a visiting professor in Venice, My office was in the same building as some of the best paintings ever painted by Paolo Veronese. But down the walk from me was the chief museum of Venice, the Accademia, and this is one of the most famous pictures in it. And it's by Giorgione, and it's called A Tempest. Now, the interesting thing about this picture is I haven't the faintest idea what's going on in this picture, and I can't figure it out, and I've looked it up. You can look it up, and nobody else knows what the hell's going on in this picture either. There is a guy who's clearly a military character on the left. There's a woman nursing her baby on the right. There's a storm off in the distance, and there's some peculiar rock formations. But what is happening, I have to tell you, the background isn't coming to my rescue on this one. Can you see it all right? Is it in focus? I guess it's about as in focus as you can get. Okay, so I'm just giving you these more or less random examples to show you that your interpretation of anything will be fixed by a set of background presuppositions, considerations, assumptions, and general know-how, general capacities for coping with the environment. Well, I brought some more, but we should really go on and talk about personal identity. Just in case you think Vermeer could never do anything as vulgar as what I'm suggesting he was doing, well, have a look at this one. I mean, Vermeer is an exquisite painter. And there are only somewhere about 30 Vermeers in existence. And once when I was a kid, I was in Chicago, and I went to the Art Institute, and I said, "Where do you keep your Vermeers?" And they were acutely embarrassed. They don't have any. I mean, God, they wish they did. But in any case, here's another Vermeer. I don't know the title of this one, but it's pretty clear. This one is unambiguous in a way that the other one at least admits of different interpretations. Okay, that's the art history section of this lecture, and now we go back to work on personal identity and other such subjects. The thesis that I'm trying to get across to you is that all representation is subject to interpretation, and that the interpretation is not fixed by the content of the representation. Even if it's a literal sentence, the cat is on the mat, 2 + 2 = 4, you have to have a set of capacities. You have to have a set of abilities for interpreting, for applying the intentional content. And that this is true in the case of pictorial representation as much as it is in the case of linguistic representation. All right, now we're going to resume to the topic that we were talking about when I stopped last Thursday, and that is the topic of personal identity and the self. Now, first of all, I have to say, well, any questions about what I've said so far about these pictures or about the general thesis that interpretation is not just a function of intentional content, but of intentional content as applied, and the application is not fixed by the literal meaning of the sentence, nor fixed by, in these cases, by the marks on the paper and the physical resemblance that they may have, that they have to objects in the world. Let me say a little bit about resemblance. The natural way to explain painting is by saying, well, in the initial case, the painting works because or photography or anything else, it works because there's a resemblance relation between the object you see, the painting or the photograph, and the object being depicted. Now, the problem with that, a lot of philosophers have objected to that. They say, well, really, it doesn't look like that. If you look at a picture of Winston Churchill, the picture's two-dimensional, and Winston Churchill was three-dimensional, so it really doesn't look like Winston Churchill. And I think that's a bad argument, but it is an argument that's used by Nelson Goodman, for example, in his book, The Languages of Art, that there is no actual physical resemblance. But the answer to that is that the representation, as you know from this course, is always under an aspect. And the way in which there's a resemblance relation is specifically under an aspect. And of course, the picture resembles the object under certain aspects and not others. And it's under those aspects that it can be said to represent. If somebody says, draw a picture of Winston Churchill, and I drew that, and somebody says, well, how is that a picture of Winston Churchill? And I say, well, it's actually a picture of his left nostril. Well, okay, for all I know, his left nostril might look like that. I'm sorry to pick such a sordid example, but it's about the only thing I know how to draw at 10 in the morning. The point is that when we think of drawing a picture or a pictorial representation of a person, we tend to think of the frontal view of the face. We don't think of what the person looks like at the bottom of their heel or inside their left nostril. So it's not an objection to say, well, in all sorts of ways, the picture and the person don't look like each other, because the representation is always under some aspects and not others, and it's only under that aspect that there is a representation. And the representation works by resemblance. Okay, that's one objection to the resemblance theory. Now there's a more, that's by Nelson Goodman. There's a more subtle objection by Richard Wollheim. And Wollheim says, yes, the man in the picture looks like the actual man, but you can't use that resemblance to explain pictorial representation, because the resemblance in question is pictorial resemblance. So it's circular to try to explain the relation of resemblance to explain representation by saying there's a resemblance relation between the object depicted and the picture itself as an object. That's a more interesting objection, and there's something right about that. We do learn to see pictures. You have to learn how to look at a Van Gogh. And when he first started painting these things, people didn't know what to make of them. It's interesting to go back and read what the London critics said about post-impressionist exhibits in 1910. And they weren't stupid guys, it's just they literally couldn't see. They had not learned to see these pictures. So there is a sense in which our ability to see pictures as pictures does require a certain mastery of the practice of pictorial representation. But all the same, the whole system, nonetheless, in its traditional, in non-abstract, in so-called figurative painting, in figurative pictorial representation, rests on our ability to see resemblances. Now, once you can see the resemblance between yourself and the reflection in the lake, then you're off with the possibility of creating further variations on the picture which go beyond the sheer simple isomorphism of the resemblance relation. So I think Wollheim is right that our normal ability to see pictures as pictures presupposes our understanding of the institution, of the practice of picturing. But all the same, it just seems mistaken to say that pictures don't work by resemblance relations. In a very few days, I will be presenting pictures of myself to various authorities. The pictures look dreadful, but if they look like a pile of coal on a dark night, they won't let me on the airplane. There has to be some kind of resemblance, or the system doesn't work. So I'm arguing that pictorial relation does require resemblance, even though once you've mastered the practice of pictorial representation, you can get all sorts of non-resemblance relation in the pictorial relation, or you can vary the resemblance relation. You can learn to see a starry night the way Van Gogh painted it. Indeed, I think once you look hard at the Van Gogh pictures, the world never looks the same. The best collection is in Amsterdam now, and that's a fairly recent collection where they put a whole bunch of Van Goghs together. The guy painted 800 pictures in his life, and the beauty of the internet is you can download every one of the damn 800. I've done it. I have them on my computer, and you can get them. They're readily available. It turns out not all of them are very good. The ones that you see over and over tend to be the best. Okay. Anyway, just to summarize 2 points I made. One point I made is you really don't understand pictorial representation if you don't see the role of resemblance. It's a complex role, but it has to be there. This is the difference between figurative painting and abstract expressionism. I was trying to write an article about this crap, and I was having a lot of trouble. And in the course of this article, trying to explain the role of resemblance in representation, I conceived a passionate hatred of abstract expressionism. I'd always liked this stuff up to that point. I was in the Chicago Art Museum that's when I was looking for the Vermeers, and I went down in the basement, and there they were, Pollock and de Kooning and the whole gang, Klein. And I thought, that's where you bastards belong, is in the basement. Well, that was a bit anti-intellectual. It's a bit unfair. But in any case, there is a radical break between the intellectual content of, let's say, post-impressionism and the kind of thing you get in Jackson Pollock. Okay, questions about that? Now I'm going to go on and talk about the self and personal identity, but you had a question. Yeah.
This has to do with the background in externalism.
Yeah.
Internalism.
Yeah.
It seems like the background is a structure that you could argue that it's internal to it's internal in our mind.
It's in the brain, right?
It is, but it also seems to have a very external aspect to it.
Well, of course, all of this stuff relates you to the real world. That's the whole point of the background, is that it's shaped by your experiences of the world, and it enables you to cope with the world. But your ability to cope is entirely inside your brain, even though often you rely on other people, but then you're relying on what's inside their brains. So it's I think a standard mistake in the discussion about externalism and internalism is somehow the idea that internalism is committed to a kind of solipsism. It isn't. No, on the contrary. What we're precisely trying to explain is how my relation to the environment, including my relation to other people, enables me to cope in all sorts of ways. And that, I want to say, is going to have to consist in a description of how these things impact on the brain and how my brain enables me to relate to them. So there's no solipsism implicit. In an attack on me, John McDowell says, well, the idea that you might have thoughts and feelings in a brain in a vat is just crazy because, as he says, it's all dark in there. Well, I want to say, always put it in the first person. I'm talking about this brain in this vat. The skull is a kind of a vat. And I get all sorts of input to my brain from my receptors, and the whole body system enables me to continue to function, to stay alive. So if you look at it from the first person point of view, then we are all brains in vats because the skull is a kind of a vat, and the brain in the vat fantasy is designed to remind us that all of our cognitive capacities have to be internalized in this particular container because this is the vat in which my brain exists. And the idea that somehow or other it's all dark, this is if I turn off all the lights and gone to sleep. No, it's not like that at all. So, however, I have to say, as far as exposition is concerned, I've lost this battle. That is, people don't really understand the conception of internalism, whereby I use the brain in the vat fantasy, even though I think it is a useful fantasy. So I've quit using it because people start to think, well, you must be raising a skeptical question. How do you know you're not just a brain in a vat, etc.? That's not the point. The point is to remind us of the resources that we have for coping with the environment, and they have to be in our nervous system. Okay, any other questions at this point? That's an important question. All right, back to the self. Now, you remember I said a problem with our philosophical tradition is that the problem of the self and the problem of personal identity tend to be treated as the same problem. Indeed, in the classic Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which was published about a generation ago, with Paul Edwards was the editor. It's a good encyclopedia. If you look up The self, it says see personal identity. And the idea was that the reason we need to postulate the self is we need to account for the question, well, what fact about me makes me the same person as the person who lectured here last week? Now, from the third person point of view, from the external point of view, you're inclined to say, well, it's the same body. This same body moves through space and time. It's the spatio-temporal continuity of the body. But the problem is that's no good from the first person point of view, because the story of Gregor Samsa, who wakes up in bed with his body transformed into the body of a huge insect, well, that makes sense to us. Of course, we know that it's science fiction. It could not actually happen, but we can understand what it would be like to have a body totally different and yet still be the same person. Another thought experiment, which is less implausible, is the idea of brain transplants. We do all sorts of organ transplants. Now imagine a brain transplant. And you imagine that your brain is transplanted into a different body. So you wake up in a different body. There you would feel, I would feel all the same. It's still me. Now you get puzzle cases. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that the two hemispheres have the same capacities, the same memories, the same linguistic abilities, and you take the two halves of your brain and transplant each half into a different body. Now, which one is the real you? Does everybody get the story? That is, you imagine that the two hemispheres are equal in their capacities. And by the way, there are cases of people who've survived and led conscious lives with only half a brain. There are what are called, cheerfully, hemispherectomies, where they cut off half of your brain. I assume you've got to be in pretty bad shape in that half. They're going to cut off the whole damn thing. But there are cases like that. So why not imagine a case where your brain is split in two, and you have two different bodies, each, well, what are you going to say? Each with a equal claim to be you. Now the problem is, you feel there ought to be a right answer to that, because suppose now, right now, you discovered actually you are the result of a semi-brain transplant from Sally or Billy, depending on your gender. And so are you the real Sally or are you the real Billy? And you feel, well, look, this guy right here, that's authentic. He's the real thing. There might be some other twin imitator, but we do feel somehow that there ought to be an answer to the question, which is the real me? Yes.
Well,
Jennifer.
There actually are. You don't need to transplant the two halves of the brain. They can actually do experiments where you freeze one side and activate the other. And the data is very scary because you have two different, you'll answer differently to different questions.
I see.
Two different personalities.
So you got two different personalities in your brain. So the popular idea of the left brain, right brain, which I always thought was probably nonsense, there may be something to that then.
There is.
Well, okay, and there are there are these wonderful experiments where you get the left brain to answer. I've told you about those, about the split brain cases, where you get the left brain to give one answer to the question and the right brain to give another answer. Okay, but now let's suppose we separate the two questions. What is the nature of the self from what are the criteria of personal identity? Then it seems to me that the criteria that we tend to use, let's take what I think is the easier question first, the criteria of personal identity. The criteria that we tend to use really break down to four. One, from the public point of view, the most important, is the spatio-temporal continuity of the body. It's the same body from the time you were born. That's not sufficient for personal identity, but it's the one that is used in practice. A second, which is really a variation of that, is, roughly speaking, changes and transformations of the body have to be regular. So it's true, I don't look the same as I did 50 years ago. A depressing thought, but it's true. But all the same, if I suddenly look like an elephant or a mountain, or a small kitty cat, then we'd be in trouble. So you have to have not just the same body, but you have to have, roughly speaking, predictable, regular transformations of the body. And again, the science fiction thought experiments will support this. I imagine my body looking radically different, but you can imagine cases of fusion and fission. As I mentioned before, it's an important fact about us that we use biparental reproduction, but the amoeba don't. So why don't we reproduce like the amoeba? Why don't we just, when walking along the street, suddenly split into 2 or 4 or 6? And now suppose that happened. Suppose such things occurred. Which one would be the real you? I think there's no answer to that question. We'd have to decide. It would have all sorts of practical implications. Who owes the money to the bank? Whose driver's license is it? Who gets the degree on graduation day? And so on. But all the same, those look like practical issues over what is a theoretical possibility. Another, more depressing possibility is not just fission, but fusion. So 3 of us are walking along the street, and suddenly we coalesce into one, like drops of water. Now, which is the real one? Which is the original? Again, I don't think there would be an answer to that. We'd want to go into more detail. But then we now get to other criteria. The 2 criteria we picked so far are spatio-temporal continuity and, roughly speaking, regular changes. But now that's not what satisfies us from the first-person point of view. From the first-person point of view, this is where the self comes in. It looks like there's a continuity to my consciousness. What makes me me is that the consciousness that I have today is a continuation of the consciousness that I've had for these many decades. And I am aware, not just that I am now giving you this lecture, but that I'm aware that I'm the same guy that lectured on these subjects in this room last week and the week before that. Now, Locke put this by saying that the condition of personal identity is the condition of what he called consciousness, but it's clear that he meant memory, not just in my sense, subjective awareness, but he meant a continuation of my sense of myself as a person having these experiences across time. So the consciousness that he describes is meant to include memory. Indeed, I think he uses it so that it is equivalent to memory. And as I mentioned briefly, there's a puzzle about taking memory as sufficient and necessary for personal identity, because identity is transitive, but memory isn't. Let's suppose I'm identical with a kid who enrolled in a university as a freshman, and that kid is identical with a kid who enrolled in kindergarten. The freshman might remember the kindergarten experience, and I remember the freshman experience, but I don't remember we'll suppose I don't remember the kindergarten experience. So if you say memory is the necessary and sufficient condition of personal identity, then you get a breakdown, because you want to say the same person as the person who enrolled in kindergarten, and there's a continuity of my consciousness from that person, but all the same, my memory doesn't go back from now until the time I was 5 years old. There are breaks in the memory, even though there are no breaks in the identity. So it won't do quite to say that memory is the sufficient condition of the first-person notion of the self, but it's certainly an essential part. And Leibniz put this by saying, imagine that you were made emperor of China, but that all of your memories were wiped out. Absolutely everything. A total amnesia. But you're made emperor of China, and maybe they program your brain so that you can speak Chinese, but you lose all of your previous memories. Now, said Leibniz, there's no difference between that supposition, the supposition that your memories are wiped out, but you become emperor of China, and the supposition you are killed and a new emperor of China is created. because the you that's you from your first person point of view requires some sort of continuity of memory. And I think there's something to that. I don't know if I'd want to go so far as Leibniz and say it would be equivalent to death. Why? Well, this now gets the harder point where we talk about the self. And now I'm going to launch into a discussion of the self. And I don't know if, I think I must have published this somewhere. Maybe it's in that, in Mind, but I'm going to talk about the self and the ground that we have for trying to answer Hume. Remember I told you Hume's skepticism about the self has, I think, been pretty decisive, certainly very influential. And Hume says it's just a plain fact about my experiences that I do not experience a self. I don't. I experience myself giving a lecture and drinking beer and going for a walk and going skiing, but I don't, in addition, have an experience of the self. All the same, I'm going to say, when I have an experience, I don't just have an experience. My experiences don't come in the way that Hume described as a sort of random sequence of impressions. But each experience comes to me as my experience. Now, what does that mean? As philosophers in cognitive science, can we make any sense of that? That my experiences come as my experiences. I'm going to try to work up to that. Okay, questions about what I've said so far, about Hume's skepticism about the self. You remember Hume says, there are these heavy-duty metaphysicians who tell me that they're always aware of the self. He's thinking of Descartes. But he says, for myself, when I try to concentrate my attention on the self, all I find is some particular impression or idea. There's nothing in addition to the impressions and ideas. Now, I think Hume's conception of experience doesn't make any sense. And the reason can be put very simply. On Hume's account, if the mind just is a sequence of impressions, then there would be no difference between a guy having 5 different impressions, say he's seeing 5 different color patches, and 5 different guys each seeing 1 color patch. But there obviously is a difference. Does everybody see this point? If the mind just consists in a sequence of impressions, then you wouldn't be able to distinguish between several impressions in the same mind and those same impressions in several different minds, each of which contained 1 impression. I seem to have run out of chalk. Well, yeah. I won't scratch on the blackboard with my fingernails because that'll create extreme I have a tiny fragment here. Okay. So it looks like there's something wrong with Hume's account of experience. Remember I told you, Descartes thought the mind is like a bucket, and you've got all these experiences in it. And every time you have an experience, it's part of the bucket. It's part of the soul. Hume comes along and says, there isn't any bucket, and there couldn't be. There's just the sequence of your experiences. So if you think of the bucket theory of the mind as like this, with all these experiences in it, Hume is telling us not only can there not be is there not an experience of a bucket, there's no self, but if there were, it would just be another experience. Any experience you had would just be an experience, and as Hume says, all of our impressions are on the same footing. And I think Hume's right about that part, that no experience could count as giving you the unifying principle that we want the self to do. I used to know a philosopher, Elizabeth Anscombe, and Elizabeth had an eye defect that she used very effectively in philosophical arguments. So whenever they're talking about vision, Elizabeth would say, well, I now see a large yellow blotch on that wall. Well, that's because Elizabeth saw a yellow blotch all the time, every day. That was part of her eye defect. But the point is, suppose somebody said, well, that's what the self is. There's a continuous experience which constitutes myself. It's a yellow blotch. And Hume's answer, I think, would be correct. The answer is, that's just a yellow blotch. That's just one experience like any other. That doesn't give you the unifying character that you want the notion of the self to give you. Okay, so I'm now going to give you a sort of an argument for the self, but it's not going to answer Hume directly. I'm not going to say we have an experience of the self in addition to our other experiences. Now, I went through a lot of the history of philosophy very fast, so let's take questions about that. Yeah, at the back. I can't hear you. I'm practically deaf. Can somebody translate?
Can you repeat the fourth criteria for personal?
Oh, yeah. All right. Let me go through them. 1, personal continuity of body. 2, relative regularity of changes. 3, continuity of memory. And I didn't give you the 4th. I'm not there yet, but I'll give it to you right now. And that is, in our own case and in dealing with other people, I think we regard continuity of personality as an essential characteristic of personal identity. And again, the classic case here is a neurobiological case, Phineas Gage. And we're so bored with Phineas Gage by now, but Phineas Gage occurs in all the textbooks on the brain. Phineas Gage was a railway worker, I think in New England in the 19th century. And there was an explosion, and a steel bar went clean through his head. Now, miraculously, he didn't die. But his personality was totally changed. Whereas before he'd been friendly, cooperative, responsible, reliable, and hardworking, once the steel bar had gone through his head, it was removed, he survived. Once the steel bar had gone through his head, his personality was totally different. And in colloquial speech, we would say he became a different person, where his friendly, cooperative nature was replaced by a guy who was surly, mean-spirited, it sounds a bit like a professor, mean-spirited, aggressive, and uncooperative, and lazy. So this is a case where we feel, well, of course, he still had to pay Phineas Gage's income tax, and he still owned his property. All the same, we feel, in some sense, it's no longer the same person, with a radical neurological damage, with a radical damage that changed the personality completely. You get a change. Let me put this more carefully. Our notion of personal identity is applied against a background of a certain set of assumptions. And one set of assumptions we make in applying personal identity is relative continuity of personality. A sudden dramatic change from one sort of person to a completely different sort of person leads us to feel that it's not the same person. Now, it'll be very interesting to see how the possibility of sex changes alters our conception of people. I once went home for dinner and I said, what's the most amazing thing I could tell you about Tom? It was a guy we knew not well, but we knew him well. And she said, well, I don't know, maybe he divorced that boring woman. No, that's not the most amazing thing I could tell you about Tom. The most amazing thing I can tell you about Tom is he's now Deirdre. Tom became Deirdre, and it's a kind of famous case. I'm not revealing any secrets. He was a professor of economics, and he just showed up at the office one day, said, I'm no longer Tom, I'm Deirdre. And to their credit, it's not in this university, it's a different university. The economics department just accepted him and accepted her. And I think she's written books about her experiences. And I think, well, I guess it's still the same person. That was a bit of a surprise. It isn't, I mean, the pre-Deirdre person gave no indication whatever. I used to talk to him or her about a football season and things like that. There was no indication that really there was any dissatisfaction with the gender identity. Anyway, so that's the fourth criterion, and it's the weakest of the four, but I think it's worth mentioning because of these dramatic cases like Phineas Gage. Okay, now I want to,
Would it be right? It seems like this question of personal identity is more a question of what do we want to say?
Yes, okay. Then, in fact, yes, no, this is a very good point. I wanted to make it, so let me make it now. The classic puzzle about personal identity is the ship of Theseus. And the ship of Theseus was a wooden ship, and it was the parts of a wooden ship were gradually replaced as they became worn. Now, with a replacement of the mast or replacement of the deck, is it still the same ship? And the answer is, yeah, we would still treat it as the same ship. It still has the same registration, the same owner, and so on, same crew. It's still the same ship. But now, after all the parts have been replaced, suppose you went and assembled all the original parts into a ship which had all and only the parts from the original ship. Which is the ship of Theseus, the one that is a result of all of the replacements, or the one that contained the original parts. Now, I think the point you're making is we feel, look, it doesn't matter because the facts are known. The facts are the same in both cases. In one case, we use continuity of function as the criterion of personal identity. And that's where we say it's still the same ship even though the parts are different. And in the other case, we use spatio-temporal continuity of the original parts as the criterion for the identity of the original ship. But at a bottom level, I feel, and what you're hinting at, it's up to us to decide. There isn't any fact of the matter about is it still the same ship. It's just, well, you can say what you want depending on what your interests are. From the point of view of the law, I think it is the original ship has now been replaced by the one with all the new parts, because that's the one that has the registration, that's the one that has docking rights, that's the one where the ownership is. But from the point of view of some philosophical interest, we might want to say, no, the original parts are what count. I don't think there's any important fact. But here's the puzzle. Where our own identity is concerned, we're less willing to say, well, you can say anything you like. Would it still be me or not if I underwent some radical surgery and my brain was destroyed and somebody else's brain was put in my skull, or somebody else's brain was then programmed so it's much like my brain? We feel, I'll give you the ship, but I won't give you me. So we think there's more involved in our own case than there is in these other cases, and I want to come back to that point. Okay, so now let me slowly build up, or maybe since we don't have a lot of time, rapidly build up a further discussion of the self. It seems to me, just in order to account for our ordinary talk of ourselves and other people, we need a non-Humean notion of the self. And the argument for that is that we attribute reasons for our actions, which we know are perfectly valid in explaining our actions, but which don't meet the standard scientific criteria for scientific explanation. If you ask me, who did you vote for in the last presidential election? I'm not very original in that particular election. And I say, well, I voted for the Democratic candidate. I voted for Barack Obama. And you say, well, why did you vote for him? And I can give you an answer to that. I can say, well, I voted for him because I thought he would have a better domestic policy. I thought his foreign policy would be pretty much exactly the same as Bush. I was right, incidentally. There's no change in the foreign policy. If anything, Obama's foreign policy is more Bush-like than Bush. If you look at our policies in Afghanistan, he just goes Bush one better, and he has better PR. He has much better public relations than Bush did. But I'm digressing. The point is, here's what's interesting. I know why I voted. I know that I voted for this guy because I had this reason for voting. Now, that's very interesting, logically, because I had a whole lot of reasons. I could have voted for him for this reason or as opposed to that reason, but that's not the case. I voted for him for a specific reason, and I know without observation, I don't have to do an investigation to figure out why I voted for him. I voted for him for a specific reason, and now watch this jargon, I made that reason effective by acting on that reason. What does that mean, to say I acted on a reason? See, if you look at the standard philosophical accounts, They treat beliefs and desires as just forces like any other. And when you act on your beliefs and desires, it's just this. It's like a vector of forces in physics. The beliefs and desires produce this action and not another. And I want to say, no, that's wrong. You act on your beliefs and your desires, and that's a manifestation of the gap that we discovered in our discussion of free will. Okay, but now let's suppose I'm right so far that I know without observation why I voted for Obama, and that I can give you the reason, and that I made that reason effective. That's step one. But now step two, does that reason give you a deterministic reason? Does that give you causes which were sufficient, causally sufficient, to determine the action? And here I'm repeating what I said when we talked about free will. As far as my own experience is concerned, part of the experience was the experience of the gap. I acted on that reason, but I could have acted on some other reason. That is to say, I could have voted for the other guy. I was not in the grip of a rage or a passion. No, I thought about which one to vote for, and I voted for that guy for that reason. But now what's puzzling is this. The argument is fully explanatory. It explains my behavior, but the argument is not deterministic in form because it doesn't say why I acted as opposed to doing something else, why I acted one way as opposed to doing something other, which shows why I had to act that way, which shows that there was no possibility of my acting otherwise. And in that respect, it differs from standard explanations. If I'm asked, I let go of this piece of chalk and drop it, and if am I asked why it fell because of the force of gravity. But the force of gravity was sufficient to determine it had to fall. In those circumstances, it had to fall. There's no way it could have behaved other than by falling. But in my case, when I make a free decision, when I decide to do something in the gap, then my decision is such that it will explain why I acted. But it's not deterministic in form. That is, the explanation that says, I did this because I was acting on this reason, doesn't show why I had to do the thing I did, because I didn't have to do the thing I did. I could have done something otherwise. Now, a lot of philosophers are uncomfortable with that result, and two of them, Tom Nagel and Galen Strawson, have written about this, and I think what they say is mistaken. But here's what they say. If the explanation you give wasn't deterministic, then it doesn't explain. It wouldn't explain why you did what you did as opposed to doing something else, which you could equally well have done according to your own theory of the gap. That is, in order for an explanation to explain, it has to explain why what happened had to happen. And I want to say that's not true of rational human behavior. Rational human behavior, deciding to go to law school, or who to vote for, or who to get married to, or where to live, or which apartment to accept, all of those are typically made with an awareness of alternatives. Yes, I'm doing this, but I could be doing something else. But if that's the case, then those explanations don't meet the Galen Strawson and Tom Nagel. They don't meet their condition that an explanation, in order to explain, has to state sufficient conditions. All the same, I want to say those explanations are perfectly adequate. Why are they adequate? I mean, why is it perfectly adequate for me to say I voted for Obama? Because I thought he would have a better domestic policy. I was right, incidentally. It is better than the Bushes had. It would have a better domestic policy. And that explanation explains because it states the reason I acted on. But that means that the form of the explanation is actually different from the form of the explanation I gave of the falling chalk. The form of the explanation I gave of the falling chalk, the force of gravity, states sufficient conditions. But the other explanation, the form of the explanation when I say I voted for Obama because I thought he would have a better domestic policy, that does not state sufficient condition. That has a different form. What's the form? What is the underlying logical structure of these explanations? So I've made 2 points so far. One is that the explanations don't have the standard form of stating sufficient conditions, and 2, they're perfectly okay. There's nothing wrong with that explanation. It isn't that there are all these surveys that show, well, okay, so you're a middle-class professor with such and such an education, then you're overwhelmingly statistically likely to vote this way rather than that way. That may be true, but that does not explain why I voted. The explanation of why I voted has to state the reason I acted on. And what does that mean to say I acted on it? Let's go to the next step, and this is the step that I think is important for this discussion. In order to understand how the explanation works, we have to examine its logical form, and the logical form is quite different from the logical form of standard scientific explanations where you explain how the operation of a causal law, such as the law of gravity, determined certain events to happen. The form of the explanation, when I'm explaining my own rational behavior, requires us to postulate that there is an agent, what I'm going to call a self, that makes a reason effective by acting on that reason. Now, what's the argument for that? Here, notice we're in a kind of Kantian problem. The Kantian problem is, given certain facts, what must be the case in order that those facts can exist? It's called a transcendental argument. I mean, there are many senses of that, but in one sense. Now, here's the fact. The fact is, I give you an explanation that's a good explanation, but it doesn't look like standard covering law explanations in the natural sciences. Yet, all the same, it's a good explanation. Now, our question is, how can that be? Another piece of jargon you should be familiar with is conditions of possibility. What are the conditions of possibility of the adequacy of that explanation, given that it is not like standard scientific explanations? And I'm going to argue that conditions of possibility require, their explanation only makes sense if you they require that you postulate the existence of a conscious, rational self capable of reasoning and capable of deciding, and then acting on its decisions and taking responsibility for its decisions. That is, what you've got to suppose in order to make sense of that explanation is there's a single X such that X is conscious, X is capable of understanding reasons for action, X is capable of making one or more of those reasons effective by acting on that reason, and X is capable of accepting responsibility for the action. And another name for that X is the self. In order to make sense of the explanation, you have to suppose that there is a self which has all of these features. Consciousness, reason appreciating, capable of initiating action, and capable of accepting responsibility for actions. That's what we think of as a human self. Okay, wonderful, hands up. First Jennifer, then you. Yes?
Yeah, does this single X extend through time?
Mm-hmm. That's another feature. I didn't list all of them because I can never remember all of them. But another feature is an important point. The X has to be extended in time because the guy who voted on such and such an occasion for such and such a reason has to be the same guy as the guy who is now giving you this explanation. Now, in philosophy, you have to allow yourself to be astounded by what any sane person takes for granted. And in any sane person takes for granted, yeah, you have a whole lot of reasons and you act on one and not the others. But if reasons were just causes like anything else, then that couldn't be. The way you figure out the causes is you do a vector of forces. You figure out all the causes operating, and you do a summation. But in the case of voluntary human actions, you don't do a summation to figure out the explanation of the action. I had a whole lot of reasons for voting for and against either candidate, but I made one of those reasons effective by acting on that reason. And what I'm saying is that requires us to postulate a single entity which has all of those properties. It's conscious, extended in time, capable of reasoning, capable of appreciating reasons, capable of initiating action, capable of carrying out action, and capable of accepting responsibility for actions. It wasn't just anything that happened, but it was my action. Okay, guy at the back, yes. Yeah.
Is the rational self degraded? How fully rational is the decision?
I'm not sure I heard the question, but I'll answer it, and then you tell me if I fail to hear it, which is quite possible. The way I hear the question, you're asking, well, how much responsibility do you have to take? And of course, it can vary enormously. The point, however, is you can't just say, well, it's just one of those things. I just happened to vote for the guy. But there was no reason that I voted for him, and it's like it rains in Berkeley sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't rain. Just that's the way it happened. That's not a case of accepting responsibility or of explaining an action. You see, when I explain my behavior, I'm not just citing a random event that occurred. I am giving you a reason which explains the action, and the reason it explains the action is not because it gives a causally sufficient condition, but because the self made that reason effective by acting on it. Now let me give you the next step, which is crucial, and that is, how does this answer Hume? You don't experience the self, not so far, as I have described it. It's a formal postulate. It's like this. Whenever I see something, I see it from a point of view. And in order to explain vision, I have to suppose that there is a point of view from which I see things. But I don't see the point of view. The point of view is not itself seen. There must be such a thing as the point of view, or I couldn't see anything. But the point of view is not itself seen. Now, exactly the same, I want to say, the self has to be postulated in order to account for my actions. And it's part of the experience that I experience these actions as brought about by the self, but there's no experience of the self. The self is a formal postulate, like the point of view. Yes?
His question, I think, was if rationality partly constitutes the self and rationality becomes degraded, you can tell me if I'm right or wrong.
Yeah.
Rationality becomes degraded, does the self become degraded?
Yes. If you get to the point where you're incapable of acting on reasons, where your behavior is pathological to the point of randomness, where goal-directed behavior becomes impossible, then I want to say that this argument for the self no longer has the same kind of bite. Then what you've got is more like a Humean random sequence of experiences. And I think that's a good point, that we're talking about the way that sanity enables us to organize our experiences into coherent patterns, so that we can make such things as decision to go to this university as opposed to that university, to major in this subject as opposed to that subject, etc. Yes?
Yeah, but then you get a situation where you get people who are starting to have breakdowns and
Yeah.
they're acting erratically, and you say, you can either say they no longer have a self, or they do have a self, and
Yeah.
it's just...
Okay, the notion of the self has various different senses. Now, I am talking about a particular non-Humean notion of the self, which I want to call the rational self, where there's a self capable of accepting responsibility and making decisions. Now let me explore some of these other notions that you're talking about. But I want everybody to appreciate the argument. There's another final step to the argument, and I want to give you. The reason that the explanation is adequate is not just because it seems adequate to me, but because the reason itself becomes part of the action. So when I voted for Obama because I thought he would make better domestic policy, I was literally, notice intention and action here, trying to make a better domestic policy by electing Obama. As you remember, trying is the ordinary English for the intention and action. What are you trying to do? I'm trying to improve the economy by voting for this guy. Okay, now, the notion of the self is used in other ways, and I want to mention some of them. One of the most important notions of the self is what some people call the narrative self. It's the story we tell about ourselves. And the question, who are you really, is in large part is answered by giving the story you tell about yourself. I am such and such a person with such and such a history and such set of motives and desires. And that's the question. That seems to me independent of the conception of the self that I've been giving you. The conception of the self that I've been giving you is a formal postulate necessary to account for certain types of conscious, rational behavior, where you consciously make a reason effective by acting on that reason. But in addition to that notion of the self, there is a narrative self. There's a story that each of us tells about ourselves, and incidentally, all of the discussions in politics about identity issues are often about that. If you identify with such and such a group, such and such an ethnic or national or racial group, if you have collective intentionality with such and such a group, then that can be part of your self-conception on this notion. Yes, you had your hand up.
When you say that the rational self is formally postulated, you mean is this a tacit postulation?
No. What I mean is this. Let me state it explicitly. There are certain facts. We need to explain those facts. One of the facts we need to explain is that explanations are adequate even though they don't meet the criteria for scientific adequacy. They don't give causally sufficient conditions. All the same, they're perfectly adequate. How is that possible? The answer is they have a different logical structure from the explanation of explaining the falling piece of chalk. What is their logical structure? The logical structure is not, this event happened because such and such causes were sufficient to produce it. The logical structure is, this self performed this action by making this reason effective, and it made this reason effective by acting on that reason. And what does that mean? It acted on that reason. It means that the reason itself became part of the intentional content of the action. So I wasn't just voting, but I was trying to improve the economy by voting for Obama. That's the point I'm making. Yes.
So when you say I did this,
yeah,
that's where we're postulating the self.
Yes. Okay. And the self there is it's not a direct answer to Hume. I'm not saying, well, you experience the I. I don't think you do in Hume's in a way that answers Hume, but rather you experience what you do as having a certain kind of coherence, and in order to explain that coherence, you have to suppose that there's some entity, X, and X has all these features. Now, the sense in which it's formal is that it doesn't tell you what the content is. The same type of X could be a fascist or a liberal. It could be a Democrat or a Republican. It could be male or female. It's just you need to postulate a single entity of which all of these predicates are true. It's conscious, it exists in time, it's capable of appreciating reasons, capable of acting on reasons, capable of assuming responsibility. That's why I say it's like the postulation of a point of view in order to explain vision. Okay, look, we're running out of time, and we're